So, you thought about jumping into historicals but don't know where to start? No idea which period to choose, which miniatures to buy, or which even scale to choose? Forget about the plethora of rules out there, because there's tons. As the whole process just melted your brain and you've gone, where do I start? Where do I begin? Well, I may have some solutions for you, and hopefully point you in the right direction, some easy entry points into historicals. So a lot of people have asked, where do I start when it comes to historical gaming? Are there any easy options to that side of the hobby? And the short answer is yes, there's literally quite a few available. And yes, historical gaming is a wide wargame hobby, and there's a plethora of rules, subject, historical period, miniatures, but there are some easy entry points to get you going. So basically, I looked around the historical hobby market and come up with some what I think are some good starting points for someone who's never done historicals before but likes the idea of jumping in. Because it always comes across as a hard particular part of the wargaming to get into. It's not as easy as, say, fantasy or sci-fi. I mean, you can just pop along down to the local town that has a Games Workshop store and you can jump into 40k or Age of Sigmar or Lord of the Rings, and that gives you your sort of sci-fi and fantasy flavouring. It's very easy. Everything's all there available in one shop. But historicals is a bit of a different kettle of fish. So where do we start? Well, there are quite a few companies out there like Wargames who've made historicals much easier to jump into, and they're not the only company. There are quite a few options across a few historical periods currently available on the market that have good starting entry points for you to jump into. So we'll start with the ancient period. Now this is quite a popular period with wargamers. It covers quite a large chunk of history, and it pretty much anything up to the Dark Ages or the early medieval period, depending on how you want to describe that. So if we start with Warlord Games, and they have a couple of options in this. Now they have a large mass battle game called Hail Caesar, and then they have a sort of secondary game system which is kind of skirmish level called SPQR. Both have starter sets which come with 2 armies, rules and everything you need to get going, which are a great jumping in point. And with that, if you find you don't like those rules, you've still got 2 armies that you can be used in other game systems. But to begin with, that's a good jumping in point if you want to play Ancients, and it's in 28mm scale. Now there are other options in different scales out there, but first we'll just look at the sort of 28mm scale for the time being at the moment, because that's likely, if you're moving across from sci-fi fantasy gaming, you're probably used to playing for 28mm, so we'll kind of stick with that scale to begin with. Other game systems that have a good jumping in point are Gangs of Rome by Futsal Miniatures. Now this is proper skirmish level gang warfare set in Rome, ancient Rome, and it's got some really nice mechanics with it, where you have what's called the mob, and you as your player you can hide in and out, you can go in and out of the mob to attack your opponent and then disappear back into the mob to hide from your opponent. But also the mob can get angry because it's fed up with the gangs fighting and attack your gang members. So that's quite a good mechanic, and it's quite a nice simple little game, but it gives you a flavour of ancient wargaming. and that they had starter sets for it. The first one was Blood on the Aventine, and that gave you 2 small little gangs and some scenery and the rules. The more recent or current set is called Bread and Circuses, and again that gives you 2 small gangs, some scenery, and then the rules and paraphernalia to get playing. Futsal also have another skirmish game, which is another step up from Gangs of Rome. It's a bigger skirmish battle game set in ancient Greece during the city-states period, and that's a nice way to, if you want to play ancient Greeks, called Mortal Gods. And it's quite a simple game to learn, and it's really fast to play, and the miniatures are really nice. If we then move on from ancients and we then start looking at the Dark Age, the end of the Roman period to the Dark Age period, we have quite a few offerings on the Wargames offer some starter armies for that period in both Saxon and Viking, which works for their Hail Caesar rule system. And Futsal produce a medieval rule set called Baron's War, which is again a skirmish conflict, but it's in 13th century Britain. It's basically around the power struggle between barons and the control of the country. There is no starter set for this, but if you go to the Futsal Miniatures site, everything's there on the site for Baron's War to get playing with miniatures and the rule system. And they have a couple of expansions. One's called Death and Taxes, which allows you to play during the sort of Robin Hood period. Now, Futsal also have a medieval game set in Japan called Test of Honor. It's produced by Grateful Games, but you can get it on the Futsal website, and because they have Japanese models. But there are war bands you can buy, pre-built war bands, and the rule system for that. There's not really a starter. There's a starter. I think there's starter packages, but there's not an actual starter set. Now the next one, major one for the Dark Age, early medieval period, is Saga. Now this is quite a popular system. It's by Tomahawk Studio. Whilst Tomahawk Studio don't produce miniatures, there are plenty of options out there. And if you go to Gripping Beast website, Gripping Beast will give you everything you need to start. They'll give you starter war bands plus the rules, dice to get going in there. And the Saga system covers quite a few it covers from the early Dark Age, end of the Roman period, right up to the sort of early first medieval Crusades. So that gives you a big chunk of that period. And the more popular end is the sort of later Dark Age period, where the Vikings come into play and Saxons. But it's a really good system. Saga also has a fantasy version, so you could use whatever armies you build up for the Dark Age period. You could transfer and bring them into the fantasy version if you wanted. Now, Saga's primarily skirmish level battles, but I believe it is possible to play larger battles with this system. But you can't go huge, but you can go slightly bigger than skirmish. Now, when we move from the medieval period, we start looking at the Renaissance and beyond. When we see the rise of black powder weapons, and that Warlord has a good rule set for this called Pike and Shot, and they do provide a 2-player starter set, 4-pack and shot, that covers the English Civil War. So you get, you know, Roundheads, Cavaliers. But they do also have starter army for the Landsecks, and as well as samurai to play campaigns during the Warring States conflict in Japan, when the age of musket sort of started entering into the samurai period. Firelock Games, another company, produce a skirmish game set in the golden age of piracy called Blood and Plunder, which kind of starts at the sort of end of the 17th century. This is the golden age of piracy, you know, Blackbeard and all that. I'm talking of Blackbeard, that's what their starter box is themed around. And it's basically themed around Blackbeard's last battle against the Royal Navy, Robert Maynard. So it's pirates versus Royal Navy. Two good choices. You have a pirate, or you can go down British Royal Navy. What's great about this set, I mean, this is a huge set. It comes with 2 ships. Yep, it comes with 2 ships. It's a huge chunk of a starter set. And whilst it is a little pricey for a starter, you know, compared to some starter sets, you're getting great value for money. You're getting 2 28mm scale sloops, as well as all of the pirates and Royal Navy personnel to command as well and use. So that's the sort of that period you were starting to move them, where Slavs now starting to move towards the Napoleonic. And this is probably one of the biggest periods for historicals. Now, Firelock Games also do another game, which is around sort of end of the 17th, 18th, and towards into the 18th century, and it's called Oak and Iron, and this is a naval game of ship-to-ship combat. And Warlord also do their version of ship-to-ship combat, but it's slightly later into the 18th century, and it's well into sort of Napoleonics. A company called, if you want to go smaller scale, Bacchus produced some really good options at 6mm for this, for English Civil War and Napoleonics. And they have starter sets for those periods in 6mm, which means you can being a much smaller scale means you can go bigger, grander sort of battles, which work quite well for both of those periods. And then where we are into sort of proper musket, Napoleonics and beyond, and Warlord provide some good jumping in points for that sort of 19th century, that include the Zulu War. They've got American Civil War, and they have a new system in the American Civil War, which is roughly about 15mm, and they call it the Epic. And they have one for Napoleonics and one for the American Civil War. And they have starter sets for those. They're nicely priced. They're not too expensive, and being slightly bigger scale than 6, but smaller than 28 means you can have bigger battles, but you're not. If you still want something that looks more like an actual infantryman you can see, 15, that sort of scale might be better for you, because 6mm is quite small, and if you've, like me, have sight issues at close, 6mm is just too small for me. Around the 15 mark, 10 to 15mm mark is probably the smallest I go down to. So they have some nice options in Warlord Games. They also do some 28mm options starter set, using their black powder rules. And they also have a naval game called Black Seas, and this allows you to fight out battles during this sort of period, the golden age of sail. So you can recreate battles like Trafalgar. And then once we get past the sort of 19th century and we're into the 20th century, we get in some really big options, mainly World War II. And there are quite a few options from Warlord Games in this period. They cover this period quite extensively. For a war that was only a short period of history, there's quite a few options, and not just from Warlord Games, but from other companies who are explaining it. So Warlord Games has a bolt action. Bolt action is 28mm scale battle combat system. It's sort of, I would say, it's a skirmish World War II game. It's, if you think 40k but World War II, you're kind of sort of in the ballpark area of being similar. And they provide quite a few options for that at that scale. A lot of the tanks are now plastic. They originally there were a lot of resin kits, but they're now switching over to a lot of them being plastic. And there's a plethora of tanks and vehicles you can choose from. And there's quite a few options in armies. You've obviously got the core main armies, like, you know, Britain, Germany, Soviets, and Americans, and then they've started dipping into some of the smaller ones like the Finns, or the Hungarians, so there's quite a lot of options at bolt action for you to choose from. And they have starter set, and it's a pretty good starter set, and they change that up every now and again. So they also have some other options. They have a skirmish level naval combat game called Cruel Seas, and which is a game of motor torpedo boats, harbour defences. It's a 2-player game. It's at 1/300th scale. It's quite a nice system. It's quite a nice. It's quite a fast play game, and it comes with a starter set. It also comes with starter options across the sort of major sort of players during World War II. They also have a slightly bigger naval combat game called Victory at Sea. They have a starter set for the Battle for the Pacific, which focuses around the actions of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the US Navy in the Pacific theatre of war. They also have a game called Blood Red Skies, which is aerial combat, and so that covers all the World War II, Battle of Britain, the late war period, the Pacific, and there's quite a few options for them to play in that game, the aerial combat game. Now, the next probably big game for World War II is by a company called Battlefront, and it's Flames of War. It's in 15mm scale, which means you can play slightly larger games in compared to bolt action. So if you wanted to play big large tank battles, then Flames of War is quite a good option to do this. And then they have several starter sets. They have a late war starter set for Europe, and they've recently brought out a starter set for the Eastern Front, and I believe there's Desert War starter sets. There's also starter armies. Battlefront have made this very easy to jump into, and the great thing about this particular product is the price of those starter options. They are really quite cheap, I picked up Hit the Beach when it came out, which is the late war European one, for about £30, and that gave me 2 small starting armies, one US, one German. Again, you got infantry, Sherman tanks on the US side, got Panzer IIIs, German infantry, a couple other bits and pieces, along with all as well as with all the rules, everything else you need to start playing. They've switching mostly to plastic now, so the kits are really easy to build. They're really highly detailed. The 15mm figures miniatures are really nice. They're quite nicely done. I'll show you some images. I'll show images of everything I've got that what we're covering today, and it's a nice easy game to get into, and it's sort of really good way of getting in and playing in World War II. They also have another option, which is Cold War, which I'll get onto in a bit, called Team Yankee, but we'll get onto that in a minute, because there is a skirmish game that came out last year. I believe it's Grey for Games produced it, and it's 0200 hours. Now, I haven't yet picked up a copy of this, and I'm planning to, because this isn't large-scale battles. This isn't mid-sized battles. This is missions, raids, commando raids, actions that would have been carried out by the SAS or British commandos, or if you were on the German side, by the parachute units of the Germans. So this is like, you probably call it special forces. So very small clashes between the both sides on. So going in and destroying a radar outpost, or trying to destroy naval guns and stuff on overlooking harbours and stuff like that. It's small scale raids in, destroy something, get out with as minimal casualties as possible. And they have some great miniatures which are made by Wargames Atlantic for those, and those are quite a few different starter options. There's a starter option with no miniatures that gives you all the rules and counters and everything else you need for people that have already got miniatures they want that they can use. And then there are other options where you get the Germans and the sort of commando SAS for the British. Now the Germans for this are probably worth picking up if you're not interested in getting, because you've already got Brits, Americans, something like that. The Germans are probably quite good to pick up, because it's those who would be associated with guarding stuff. So it's guys with guard dogs. It's soldiers on sentry duty and stuff like that. So rather than miniatures that are depicting soldiers in action. But yeah, it's a quite nice rule set, and I plan to get a copy, and I'll do a video on it. And it allows you to play real missions, or you could recreate missions you've seen in films like Where Eagles Dare or Eagle Has Landed, various other sort of World War II films that are around a sort of small team of soldiers trying to complete a mission. Now, beyond World War II, the options tend, where there's an easy way in, tend to sort of become a bit slim. But Battlefront, that make Flames of War, does do a Cold War version called Team Yankee. And this is kind of set in the sort of 70s, 80s, going up to the 90s. sort of the latter end of the Cold War, and they've got a nice starter set which gives you Americans and Russians or Soviets, and there's a lot of starter armies. You can get a British starter army, you can get various others, you get a Warsaw Pact one and stuff like that, and that's at 15mm again. This year they're doing they're running a campaign, an expansion based around the film that came out, I think it was in the 80s, called Red Dawn, where the Soviets invaded the US. So that will give you options that are things like pickup trucks, armed machine guns, and various other the sort of thing you'd see in current Middle East or conflicts that have happened in sort of Africa in recent years. So that gives you that sort of Cold War flavour of wargaming, of a war that never happened. It's Cold War gone hot, and so it's initially most of it's set in Europe, but I think they're now starting to expand out of Europe. So you know the one that's been released this year is set in Invasion of America. There have been some past releases where they're covered conflicts that have in the Middle East, where I think they covered the sort of 6-day war, the Israeli war, the wars around Israel and stuff like that, conflicts. So there's options to pick up bits and pieces from that if you wanted to replay some of those battles and the Gulf War and stuff like that. All that's possible. Other than that, there are some Osprey Publishing do a lot of these quick and easy rule books that are, I've got a stack of them up here. They do set in a variety of periods, and they're these. They're not expensive to pick up, and these are, and they cover quite a wide variety of different historical periods. And these are, if you want to try other rule sets, these are quite nice to jump to. They're not expensive. They're generally written by well written, easy to read and understand, and you get the great artwork from Osprey. So if you've gone Ancients, but you want to try a different rule set because you want to play something different to Hail Caesar, there are options from Osprey, and they're quite, like I say, they're quite reasonable and easy to pick up. So yeah, there's quite a few options out there that are what I would say easy entry points from a companies, and I've just touched on a few of the ones that I quite like and find that quite easy to jump in on. So historicals probably were quite a scary option to jump to if you come from having started wargaming via playing, say, Games Workshop products, and it probably wasn't an easy transition in the past. It wasn't that easy when I transitioned to historicals years ago, but now there are easy options. There are some sort of what I would call nice gateway game systems by quite a few companies out there. So like I said, if you're looking for something nice and simple to jump in on, to get your teeth into, to get started with a historical game, then some of the ones I've talked about today are quite good options. And you don't have to stick with those. Even they might just be a good gateway for you, and then you can jump to other rule sets and look at other miniature producers producing in the same scale that you've picked. But those are good jumping point into, and you can, from there you can then look at other stuff. But that's if you're used to getting a starter box where everything to get going easily then the ones I've talked about today give you that, and like I said, you can expand on that afterwards. Well, that's all for today. Hope you've liked whatever the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.